Hello. Hello, it's me, Podge, creator of Big Shot and Friends, and today I thought I'd come and give you guys like a little rundown on the general process of making an episode. For anyone who is wanting to get into making cartoons and kind of doesn't know where to start and thinks it's too hard, too unapproachable and too difficult. So personally, I've only been doing this sort of cartoon thing for about 4 or 5 months at this point. Since about like November, December last year, I started doing it. And I think like, apart from like having some like general knowledge of animation, all it really takes is like having interest in cartoons and interest in storytelling and stuff like that. You don't need to have been to film school, you don't need to have been to animation school, you don't need to have like studied at CalArts or anything to do this. It's just about like knowing what you like and having taste and then applying that taste to your own stuff. So yeah, let's just dive into it, I guess. So generally making an episode of a cartoon, whether it be short form or long form, it comes in a couple stages that you kind of break up to make things easier and you're not like discombobulated with the different sort of processes that go into it. There's a lot of sort of separate skills and processes that are applied when you're creating a cartoon. And I feel like if you don't separate them before you do it and like come up with different stages to the process, sometimes it can start to feel overwhelming and like you're doing everything, especially if you're kind of doing what I'm doing, where you're doing the sound design, the animation, the writing. The only thing I'm not really handling is the voice acting and like directing the voice acting. But yeah, it's split into multiple different stages. So the first stage for me is coming up with the general concept. The best advice I would give is kind of just constantly be thinking about your cartoon and like go about living your life. I don't think it's a very productive way to come up with ideas of just like sitting there with a notepad and just like trying to squeeze out an idea. I think usually those ideas feel forced or they're boring or they're like overly complicated. And I think the best way to come up with ideas is just kind of like always have it in the back of your head. How am I gonna like apply things to a cartoon? And then when you go about like living your life, you just see random things in the street, like ideas will pop into your head. Maybe you'll have a notepad or maybe you'll have your phone, you just go into the notes on your phone. I have like, let me show you. I have like a giant notes app which just has tons of ideas, episode concepts, just different things that I want to like apply to the show. And instead of sort of like trying to flesh out every single idea as and when I have them, it can be a bit overwhelming sometimes, or it's like I'm busy, I'm like going to get the train or something and I don't want to have to like come up with like a whole episode concept. I just write them down in the notes app on my phone, and then when it is time to sit down and create an episode, I'll kind of use one of these as like a writing prompt, so it's like a springboard to then create a storyboard from. So yeah, after you've got like all your ideas, it's time to make a storyboard. So the storyboard is kind of like essentially just like a simplified comic. It doesn't need to have like super crazy looking drawings. It doesn't need to even make that much sense to anyone apart from you, especially if you're animating on your own. Now it's different if you're like a storyboard artist for like a large production company, say you're making like storyboards for like SpongeBob or like Family Guy or something. But if you're just working with yourself, it just needs to be something to help you remember the original ideas that you're coming up with in your head. So let's say I show you the storyboard for episode 3. So yeah, this is the first shot of episode 3. As you can see, we've got the hole, and it's basically a 1-for-1 shot of what it looks like at the start of the episode, although my drawings are pretty shitty, so I kind of like use the storyboard as a way to show like very rudimentary aspects, to showcase the framing, to showcase the most important elements of the shot. If you compare this shot with the main shot in the show, you'll see that it's like missing a lot of stuff and looks a lot better in the show. There's some storyboard artists whose storyboards just look crazy good and it's like 1-to-1 for the show. But me personally, I'm not that good at drawing. Essentially, the things to focus on when you're storyboarding is, yeah, shot composition and framing of shots. I think that's like the main thing to focus on. And trying to make every shot kind of like stand on its own. I think it's a lot harder when you're recording, maybe you're writing like dialogue scenes, because it's a lot of like back and forth with characters. But I try to make like every shot like kind of look like its own little doodle picture thing and like have like composition. Think of things in terms of the rule of thirds. It's a very like rudimentary concept in filmmaking. So I've got this frame here. You split it up into thirds like so. And then you think of the shot in terms of this. As you can see, Big Shot's face is here, the boss's face is here, and the door lines up with these lines here. Now, I didn't think of that like consciously when I was making this shot. but if you ever get stuck with framing, it's a really good way to go about things, and you notice like a lot of good looking shots apply to the rule of thirds. Yeah, rules are there to be broken, so you don't need to use that in every shot, but that's just like a little tip. So my next tip for storyboarding is to like think of things in terms of motion and how the camera will move, how the characters will move, how it'll start and how the shot will end. Think of things in like terms of time. So like, for example, this shot with the boss pulling in AJ from off screen, I'm thinking the shot starts with him, just the boss, and he pulls AJ in off screen. And yeah, it's just a bit of movement and it makes the shot feel more alive, obviously. And I think that's important in animation, just doing little things to make it not feel like you're just looking at two pictures of characters. And yeah, I think it's also important to think of things in terms of movement in the storyboarding phase, although it's just still images, just because it makes it easier to plan for when you're actually going to animate stuff. And especially in 3D, when you know stuff's going to have to move in specific ways, you can then tailor the 3D model and the 3D rig to be moved in the specific ways you need to. Sometimes 3D can be a very like rigid way of making characters and stuff like that, and when you plan in advance, you can then sort of foresee any weirdness that you might need to do with the character, implement that into the rigging process or the 3D modeling process in advance, so you don't come up with any roadblocks later on and you have to like recreate everything from scratch. So yeah, also think of things in terms of like camera movement. A lot of the times I put like arrows like here, so the camera's zooming in on big shot, or like the camera's zooming in on this. Then also sometimes I'll draw things like off frame, and that's kind of like symbolized that we'll pan down from this, or like, yeah, we can kind of like play about with the framing on that. Yeah, so camera movement is kind of a thing you need to start thinking about in the storyboarding phase as well. Although you can kind of experiment, especially in 3D, you've really got the freedom to experiment with camera movement later on. So I think with storyboarding, one important thing is to not overthink things. For me personally, the storyboarding process isn't fully about cementing the story and like making everything set in stone. It's about sort of letting the ideas flow out of my head and coming up with like specific moments throughout the episode, instead of sort of like trying to set an overarching story. I think that can be done later on in the process, and it's very important for storyboarding to be like a fun, like stream of consciousness thing. So yeah, don't like think too much about like continuity, whether your idea is going to make sense or it's weird or not. You can kind of make sense of that later on, especially in the next stage, which is script writing. So depending on what style of show you're going for, script writing might not be important for you. It might be very important for you. For me, it's kind of important because I work with a lot of remote voice actors, but then there's other shows like Smiling Friends, Home Videos, Dr. Kat's Professional Therapist, where they kind of work on like using improvisation instead. And just personally, that's not the kind of thing that I am fully going for right now. I'm not like an amazing like improvisational comedian or anything like that. But if you're like trying to go for more of that style, then I don't think the script is important, and instead you can kind of write things in like bullet points or in like a series of events, or you can just like go off the animatics or the storyboard. But if you are wanting to have sort of a more like concrete, I guess like anime style way of writing, where it's very script based and you have characters saying very specific things that you want to say, then the script writing process is slightly different. But at the end of the day, the script writing is kind of just like a way to cement what's going to happen in the story, have a timeline of things, show your setting, what characters are talking, what they're going to do. So if I just grab a script to show you, here's the script from the last episode. I use this program called Scrivener. It kind of lets you format it like a script, and there's not really that many rules to script formatting, and I kind of go off the rules a lot because obviously I'm not like working at like an industry standard, like I'm making a web cartoon. But yeah, so we've got like at the top we'll have where the shot is, whether it's inside or outside, so it'll be int or x. So yeah, int convenience store, storeroom. And then we're just going to describe what's going on. Shot from inside the dark storeroom, big shot opens the door and the light from the store enters the room. And then shot from within the hole in the wall at the back of the storeroom, big shot lifts the box which is covering the hole. Shot of the hole in the wall. The hole is wedged between other random delivery boxes covered in cobwebs. So yeah, just like the details you want to be known. Kind of like you're explaining a story to someone, or you're like explaining a movie to someone. It doesn't need to be super well written. You don't need to use amazing descriptive words. It doesn't really even need to be grammatically correct because it's not a book. But yeah, you just want to describe things. How about you describe them to a friend, like a movie you saw? And then yeah, we just got the lines and stuff like that. Sometimes I will make sure to specify certain camera movements and stuff like that, just so I can remember it. Yeah, just like describe what's going on. It's really super self-explanatory. When I'm storyboarding, I do write a lot of the lines. I think that's an important part of storyboarding, which I didn't mention before, but yeah, most of the lines will be on the storyboard, and then when I write the script, I kind of just like think in my head whether that line sounds right and stuff. I imagine it in the voice actor's voice, or like, yeah, I imagine the flow of the scene a lot more when I'm writing the script, and this is where I kind of iron out any like weird inconsistencies or any jokes that like don't really land or make sense, but still don't overthink it too much. But it's just more about like making things a bit more concrete, making things make sense more, and making things have structure, thinking of where scenes start and where scenes end. So yeah, after that I send the scripts off to my video director Nelson, and he sends any sort of like casting calls for people to do. You can also do this yourself, it's just that I am very busy with this cartoon, so I can't do it all myself. So we'll send it to different voice actors, get them to record stuff, and then I listen back to it, think if there's anything that needs changing. Usually it's fine, sometimes I need to change stuff, ask for different deliveries and stuff, but usually when you're working with voice actors, I think it's best to just get them to do as many takes as possible. Obviously, if you're like not paying people, then you can't really ask them for too much of their time, and you should, you know, don't be asking people to do an hour of takes for like 4 or 5 lines. But I think a general good practice, at least for the way I do things, is to just get voice actors to do as many takes as possible. Sometimes I'll ask voice actors to improv certain things. Maybe there's like a reaction noise I need. Like a lot of the time I get Nelson, the voice actor of Big Shot, to do like a shock reaction noise, and I'll just ask him to do a bunch of different like weird noises, and I'll pick the one that works the best. An important part is to trust your voice actors. Make sure you find people that you know can do good work. And yeah, so the next phase will be modeling and rigging any characters needed in an episode. As your show progresses, you'll need to do this less and less. I think at the start of the first episode, you'll probably end up rigging and modeling a lot of characters. But usually when I make an episode now, I only need maybe like 2 or 3 new models and rigs. So my general process for modeling a character, which I'll go more into in like a further tutorial, but I'll just like kind of give you a little rundown now. I will draw the characters out. I will draw them from the front and from the side. Some people like to draw them from the back as well. That is called a turnaround, and that is how you convert it to 3D essentially. And they have turnarounds in 2D as well. It's just so you have an idea, other animators, especially if you're not working by yourself, of what the character will look like from different angles. But yeah, I'll draw that turnaround, and then I will take a picture of it, and I'll import it into Blender, and then I'll use that as a reference for the 3D modeling. I won't go too into detail on how to 3D model the characters right now, because it's a pretty lengthy and detailed process. But yeah, I kind of start with a sketch and then bring it into 3D, and then after that I will rig the character, and based on what the character needs to do in the episode, I will rig things differently. Say I want a character to sort of do some like cartoony moves, maybe like stretch their arms, or like their head will go big and stuff like that. I'll rig it differently to as if I just need a character that's going to be torso up, and he's just going to be like moving his arms like that and like talking normally. The process is different depending on what you need to do. Okay, so the next part of the process is designing the setting for each scene. This is also where storyboards and scripts come in handy, as you've obviously planned where each scene is going to be. You'll have an idea of how many settings or scenes you have to design. You want to know what angles you're going to be seeing the scene from, so you only have to design the scene from these specific angles. Like I said in one of my previous breakdown videos, when you're creating a scene, it's not like creating a scene for a video game. You don't have to design it from every conceivable angle and make it this sort of like explorable interactive space. You just have to design it from where you're going to see it. I'll show you an example here. This convenience store, which is like a scene that's going to be prevalent throughout the show. There's only a couple angles. I've never fully designed the whole interior of the store. I've designed it from the perspective of behind the counter and from the perspective in front of the counter, but there's never actually been a full store. It's all about creating the illusion, and yeah, you can be kind of lazy with it and cut corners. You just have to do stuff creatively and make sure you know what angles you're going to see stuff from. Like for example, the street scene in the Battery episode, I essentially had to design the whole street, but I didn't have to design where it ended because of the fog. You're never going to see past it. For example, some of the hill scenes in the episode, they're not even real 3D hills. They're kind of just like flat plains that look like hills, and then I'll have the characters stand on top of them. Yeah, so once you've designed the general layout of the scene, not textured anything, you just have the layout, then you can start adding little details, whether it be like the trash can outside of the convenience store in the background, or the little things inside the convenience store like the vapes and the beers and stuff. And then over time you'll start to build up a collection of little prop assets that you can then just drop into other scenes, and they'll get really easy. For example, the cave scene in the garden episode got like the little skulls, we've got all the moss on the side, we've got like the discarded cans which I reused from the convenience store. These are the things that make the scene feel real and feel lived in, and they only take like 5-10 minutes per like asset to make. They're always super simple things, but they really like bring the scene to life after you've done all the heavy lifting of like composing the general layout of the scene. Another thing that I personally think of when I'm designing a scene is the color scheme. I'm not like sitting there with a color swatch and like really super consciously thinking about it, but I try and make everything in the scene follow a general color scheme. That's not to say that like if you've got a scene that's green, everything has to be green, but yeah, you want everything to match. And I think with color theory, you don't have to learn color theory. It's something that you like feel. I think an extreme example of this is the autumn scene that I have at the start of the garden episode. There's a lot of oranges, there's a lot of yellows, there's a lot of browns and stuff. Or for example, the street scene in episode 3, there's a lot of grays, there's a lot of like muted purples, muted blues. Yeah, so like thinking of the color scheme as color scheme is a very important thing, and I think that's one of the like signature aspects of Big Shot and Friends, is the sort of the way that I use colors and stuff. And I think finding your own color scheme that feels right for you is like a thing that separates your show from other shows. I think like Adventure Time's a super good example of that. I think The Simpsons is a super good example of that. And I usually look to like anime for this kind of things. I think a lot of like early Gainax anime are like that. Wooly Cooley, Dead Leaves, Gurren Lagann. There's a lot of like very distinct color schemes, and I think just building like a list of references of things that you like is a great way to start, and then eventually you'll start to find your own voice with that kind of stuff. Okay, the next stage is the most time-consuming, the most rewarding, but also the most horrible and grueling part of the process, and that is animating. Depending on what you want to do, it'll be easier or harder. A lot of my stuff is mostly just character animation, very simple. I don't really write fight scenes, that they don't come to me naturally, and if that's your thing that you want to do, then like fair enough. Like the animation process will probably be a lot harder for you than me, but yeah, you just go for character animation. I think this is also a thing that you will just get naturally better at with time. If you watch a lot of cartoons, pay a lot of attention to how characters move. I get a lot of my inspiration for character movements from like a lot of anime, very like cutesy anime, a lot of Kyoto Animation stuff. I'm really inspired by like Lucky Star, K-On!, Azumanga Daioh. The kind of animation where characters will switch from like being on model to being this like cutesy chibi version of themselves. A lot of like exaggerated movements, changing the size of things a lot. Yeah, you want to find what style suits you for character animation. I watched a video the other day which was like kind of comparing character animation with like acting, and I think it's a very important thing to like sort of have a solid idea of how you want the characters to act and what you want their personality to be like, and that makes it a lot easier to know what kind of animation you want to do. Like when I'm animating Big Shot, it's a lot of sort of like chilled out movements. He's a very like lethargic, relaxed character, and then when he gets angry he can sort of like explode, and he'll like, you know, his head will get bigger and stuff like that. And then when I'm like animating AJ, for example, he is like a just classical stoner, so it'll be a lot of like slumped down stuff. And then when I'm animating like Boss, I want him to feel like larger than life, an almost imposing presence, so it's a lot of like looming over, being bigger than other characters, like large shoulders, like putting his arm around people and stuff like that. And yeah, I think you'll like, as you develop your characters, you'll figure out how you want to animate them based on their personality. I don't think you need to think of stuff in terms of whether it looks good or not. I think you need to think of stuff in terms of whether it's conveying a certain emotion, or whether it's conveying a certain action. And whenever you're animating, don't animate things for the sake of animating them. I think every animation should have a purpose, whether it's like a character reaching their arm out to then pick up an object, or whether it's like a character moving back to like express like their apprehension or something. I don't think you should ever just have animation for the sake of animation, and I think that can make things feel like very weird. I remember as a kid watching a lot of Newgrounds animations and stuff like that, which would like animate everything on ones and have things constantly moving, but there was no reason for the movement, and it just felt very like strange and uncanny. I think consciously and purposefully animating is a very important part of the process. And like I said with storyboarding, camera animation is very important to convey movement, to emphasize things, and it makes it a lot easier on you on the character animation side. Like say you want to have your character reacting to something shocked, instead of just having them like widen their eyes and like tilt their head back or something, you can also have the camera pan in, and that adds a lot to the motion. It gives it more energy and stuff like that without you having to do some crazy like character animation moves. Usually when you're watching stuff, you don't really think of things in terms of camera, especially when you're watching 2D stuff, but I think it's like a very important thing to learn. And just like go through some of your favorite stuff and think about how they utilize the camera. Okay, so after I've animated everything, I will render everything out. After I've rendered everything, I'll then create different transitions, like I'll show you some examples. And this is a way to kind of like help the flow of the show. I think sometimes when you're storyboarding stuff, you will kind of need to transition to a scene, but you can't think of a way to do it. I think using like very like simple cartoon anime-esque transitions is a great way. That's how I do it personally. Whether it'll just be like some objects falling down the screen as a way to like wipe between screens, or like doing something even simpler than that, like just having a fade to white or a fade to black. Thinking of the places where you're going to transition between scenes and finding creative and fun ways to do that is a good way to keep the flow of the show going. So speaking of flow, after that I go to edit the show. I use Adobe Premiere to edit, but like which editing program you use really doesn't matter. And yeah, this is where you'll kind of work out the timing and the flow of the show, and this is also where I figure out where I'm going to put the music in the show as well, and where the audio goes, and I'll lay everything out in the editing program. For this part of the process, timing is important, making sure you don't linger on shots for too long after like dialogue's finished. Also making sure you do the opposite, where you will like linger on shots in order to have anticipation for something that's going to happen. Yeah, it's all about timing, about spacing in time, and like contrasting between having like things happen very fast and then having a gap and then something happen. I think, yeah, editing is a very sort of like musical process. It's about like beats of time and stretching things out, pressing things, and yeah, flow and timing. So after the edit is done, I will then do the sound design. Sound design, I think for me, it's like a very natural thing, just because way before I did any animation, I was doing like music stuff and sound design stuff. That's what I went to school for. But I also think it's a very simple process, and I think a lot of the time people imagine sound design as this like magical, like difficult thing that you need to like learn in school and stuff like that. But I think it's like really as simple as just dragging in loads of random sound effects, layering sound effects, making sure you get like the right atmospheric sounds for different scenes. But I use this one service called Soundly, and it's just like a sound effects service. So like say I've got like a scene that's on a field with grass, I'll just search like grass in the wind, and then I'll lay that down, make sure it's not too loud, make sure it's not too quiet. It makes the scene feel a lot more real. Maybe I'll have a scene which is in a convenience store. I'll get like sound of like, you can literally just type in like convenience store room tone, and you'll have the sound of it. Maybe you get the sound of some fluorescent lights. You just gotta imagine the scene in terms of sound, and if it helps, maybe just try find those places in real life and just go out and record them. And yeah, it's like pretty easy. Past that, it's just like about layering different sound effects. So like say I want to have like character falling onto the ground, I'll just layer like different sound effects for like things hitting the floor. You gotta layer things up to emphasize it. And I think also you don't need to focus all the time on things being realistic. I think a lot of the time sound design, especially for cartoons, is about like really exaggerating things and selling things to the audience. For example, like the sound of like a bone snapping, it'll always be like in real life. I don't think that's what it sounds like when a bone snaps, but like they're using like celery and like lettuce and like all these layered things to make it just like feel more than real. And I think that's the same with like animation as well. You want to make your characters move more than they would in real life, really sell it to people, because this isn't real. Like it's a cartoon, and you need to do things to make it feel more real than it is. If I just have a normal gunshot sound effect, it's gonna seem weird in a cartoon. You've got to add like reverberation and like extra bang and stuff like that, just to really oversell things. And I think a good way to get inspiration. One of the things that inspires me the most in sound design is like old NES games, SNES games. They had a very limited like selection of sounds they can use, so they have to start like getting like creative and abstract with things. And I think that's what inspired my like use of a lot of like weird like plinky, like pinging, like like that, those kind of sounds, sort of like Mario-esque sounds. I think these abstract sounds can be used in such a wide variety of situations, and they kind of emphasize things, and it's a great way to kind of add impact to your animation a lot of the time, whether you have like the sound of cloth moving or like a random like ping sound effect when a character is surprised, like if they're like ping, it just really adds to the impact of the scene and stuff like that. So yeah, I think sound design is just a thing to experiment with. Don't overthink things. Doesn't matter if your audio is clipping. If you watch like stuff like Big Les Show, you'll see that sound design doesn't always have to be this clinical process of taking the highest quality sounds, as long as it adds impact to your scene. So that's kind of it in my general process. Hopefully this is sort of like elucidated things to do with making cartoons for you guys, and you feel more confident to go and make stuff yourself. And one final tip I'd give you is start small. Maybe try make a 30-second, 20-second cartoon that applies all these different things, and then when you do this more and more over time, you can then increase the amount of time you're doing it for, and before you know it, you'll be making like 10-minute episodes of stuff. And yeah, if you guys have any questions or anything you want me to go further in depth on, maybe I can make a more in-depth sound design tutorial. I'll show you my like audio files, or I'll give you like a tutorial on character animation. But I think next I'm going to be making a tutorial on how I model and rig a character from scratch. And yeah, thank you guys, and have a good day.